address any questions or comments that come up. All right, so let's start off with just a little bit of background. I want to start with the caveat that this is not about religion. Christ consciousness, for the purposes of what I'm talking about, doesn't, it's not limited to any particular practice, any religious practice. It is not specifically limited to Christianity. Um, I think this is a sensitive topic for that reason. A lot of people are dealing with church hurt and trauma related to, having a Christian background. I myself fall into that category. Um, but Christ consciousness, for the purposes of this workshop, doesn't really delve too much into any of that. So that's one caveat I wanted to start with. This is not a religious focused workshop at all. Although we will be talking, maybe a little bit about Jesus, but only as a figure of, someone who embodied Christ consciousness, believed to have embodied Christ consciousness. And secondly, I definitely want to be clear about not holding myself out as any sort of expert. Um, and in fact, one of the principal points of a Christ consciousness workshop, from my perspective, is to eliminate that whole idea of any sort of spiritual expert. This idea that there's some guru or some, figure, or some priest, some rabbi, some whoever that stands between you and having access to your spiritual source. In my mind, the one of the prominent features of Christ consciousness is that it focuses on eliminating that gatekeeper and that intermediary. So I definitely don't want to hold myself in any capacity out as being one of those kinds of people. A bit just quickly about my background. I have always been a skeptical kid. Since I was a toddler, I did not believe in Santa, I did not believe in Tooth Fairy, all that sort of stuff. Like, you show me anything, woo woo or, magical or mystical or whatever it is, I would have been the first person to tell you that that's not true, and that there's just some rational, explanation for all sorts of things, that we look at as, mysterious or supernatural. Um, and so I never would have imagined myself kind of diving into teaching these sorts of things, becoming, for example, like a Reiki master or, anything similar to that. But that said, I have had to live with some very intense, like mystical experiences. And that's what kind of like drove me kind of, almost unwillingly on this path a little bit because, there were just things happening that I could not explain. Fortunately, Minka, which is who this workshop is in partner with, Kripalu is in partnership with Minka to present this. Minka happened to be a sanctuary for me because I was dealing with that sort of confusion. How do I balance my super rational, skeptical mind with, sort of these like mystical, inexplicable experiences, or I guess you could call them psychic experiences I was having. I'll talk some more about those a little later, but that's just sort of my approach. So I always try to keep things grounded and super rational while also like acknowledging that there is sort of, a higher mystery, things that cannot be explained that, that does exist as well. Um, we can skip this. I understand that, I don't want to make anybody talk or anything like that if that's not what you came here to do. But if anybody would like to chime in, I'm just curious to know sort of what does Christ consciousness mean to you and what intrigued you to take this workshop? A couple brave folks who did. But again, we can pass on that. This could be just sort of rhetorical questions if you're not interested in chiming in. So going once, going
I'll
twice.
share.
All right, all right.
Oh,
Okay, go ahead. What's your name?
Christine,
Yes. Okay.
um, I um, I resonated with what you said. Really, it came because I was curious, and I can't answer the question very clearly, except that, like you, I've had some profound mystical experiences, and I guess I relate the term Christ consciousness to more of a mystical experience than a church experience. And
Mm-hmm.
I really wanted to come for the exploration to see um, uh, how you're interpreting it and how other people are interpreting it, and just delve deeper into it. So that's
That we shall definitely do. Thank you. Was somebody else saying something?
Hey, Lamar, Jessica actually put something in the chat. I am also experiencing many things that I know and see that bring me calm, ease, and connection.
Oh, great, great, great. Well, please share some of that with the group. Share some of it with me. All right, all right. So, thank you for that. Thank you for the open-mindedness. And yeah, thank you for that sort of opening to magical experiences. I think that, yeah, sort of is um, a common element to Christ consciousness. But just to be super technical, Christ, it originates from this term chrism, which I may be mispronouncing, but Christ is more of a title. It's often referred to, it is a title often used to refer to a specific person, but it is a title nonetheless. It is a title given to someone who is sort of a messianic figure, a savior, or a healer, or whatever it may be. And I think it literally means the anointed one. It also refers to um, someone who has been through the process of a consecration using oil, usually oil poured over the person's head, just to sort of formalize, that this is a person who has achieved that higher consciousness, which we could call magical or mystical consciousness. That is absolutely one aspect of higher consciousness, but ultimately it's the consciousness, that it's a transpersonal consciousness, the consciousness that, there is an awareness. There is a consciousness more than our own sort of limited human consciousness. If hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, yeah, Christ is just a title for someone who has sort of formally been initiated into that realm, if you want to call it that. And so, why is Christ consciousness something that is important right now? There is a bit of a need for it. And when I say a bit of a need for it, a huge need for it. And it's been a long-standing need for it, especially here in the United States. A great, great, great read. If you have never read this, I highly recommend it. It is Bill McKibben, The Christian Paradox. It was published in Harper's Magazine, I think it was in 2005. So 20 years ago, but it still reads as if it were written yesterday. All right. And so this is his premise, his principal premise. The article itself, it goes in a lot more detail and expounds on a lot of things, but this quote, kind of sums up the gist of it. America is simultaneously the most professedly Christian of the developed nations and the least Christian in its behavior. That paradox, or more important perhaps than the much touted ability of French women to stay thin on a diet of chocolate and cheese, illuminates the hollow at the core of our boastful, careening culture. Ours is among the most spiritually homogenous rich nations on earth. Yeah, so there is actually, funny enough, is not any particular trait, no particular claimed identity, statistically speaking. I'm not sure if that's been updated, but last I checked, there was no claimed identity that unites more Americans than Christianity. I think somewhere around roughly 65%, and some decades back, it used to be close to 90% of all American citizens identified themselves as quote unquote Christian. And so nothing seems to have been a more common thread in terms of sort of how we see ourselves or how we identify ourselves than that label. But it's just weird that, despite it, and we're the loudest also of like all the civilized nations about that label. You see politicians talking about, all right, we need to bring prayer back in schools, and this is a Christian nation, and this, that, blah, 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 blah. But, this article, what Bill McKibben did was sort of, all right, perform a bit of an experiment where he ranked the developed countries in terms of their professing of Christianity and then compared that to their actual performance of the acts that Christ, actually upheld. And so we ranked first in sort of claiming and yelling loudly our Christianity, but we ranked dead last in our actual practice of what you could call the Christ-like consciousness. Just some examples, we rank last or nearly last among all developed nations and nearly every measure of caring for the less fortunate. Um, foreign aid, and again, see, this has been consistent for decades now. Foreign aid, very recently, we see that that's probably gotten even worse. 18%, this is an older statistic, 18% of children live in poverty. I believe that number is even higher now. We rank close to last on infant mortality, access to preschool, food insecurity and nutrition, and probably any other number of metrics that involve caring for those who are vulnerable. God, please don't even get me started on immigrants and our treatment of immigrants. Like just any sort of any measure of caring for those who are less fortunate, we tend to be bad on. Same thing with violence and retribution. Our murder rate is higher than our peer nations. We are the only Western democracy that still executes people, and that has been the case for a couple decades at least. I think about at least 20 years. And we absolutely imprison more people than anyone in the world. This kind of shocked me because China's population dwarfs ours by a lot. And so just thinking about that, just in raw numbers, China's population is so much higher than ours, and yet we still incarcerate and imprison more people than they do. And in fact, breaking the United States down one by one, each of the U.S. states it by itself incarcerates more people per capita than most countries do. Each individual U.S. state per capita imprisons more people than most nations in the world. And so, yeah, there's a paradox there, right? And so, what's behind it? Just really quickly, some of the things we do that are not of this sort of Christ consciousness or that are calling for Christ consciousness. A major one is authoritarianism. Um, this idea that there is a hierarchy and there's a boss, a big kahuna at the top of the totem pole, and rank and file falls underneath. And there is this sort of unquestioning submission to authority figures that sort of animates this paradox in some ways. And it's some of the issues that a Christed mind has to deal with. It's how do you deal with an environment or special or governing forces that are very authoritarian. But that does seem to be kind of what we do. I'm not sure if this video will work. Yes, it will. All right, perfect. I just want to give an example of what I mean by our blind sort of authoritarian sort of mentality and the damage that that can do. What I'm about to show you is just a short video on something called the Milgram experiment. You may or may not have heard of this, but there was a psychology professor named Stanley Milgram who, after World War III, just sort of wanted to study, well, how is it that so many people kind of fell in rank and file with the Nazi regime, right? And, you had all of these sort of reasonable, what you would think are moral, normal people who were just doing and executing these very cruel, inhumane orders. And so to study that, this psychology professor sort of had the premise that, well, how much are we really that authoritarian? How much do we really just fall in line with what an authority figure tells us to do? And the results are a little bit surprising. Let's just, watch the video.
A decade earlier, psychologist Stanley Milgram had also looked at how we respond to authority. In order to understand how people were induced to obey unjust regimes and participate in atrocities such as the Holocaust, he set up an experiment. Volunteers were told they were taking part in scientific research to improve memory.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Where? Teacher.
Separated by a screen, the teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect. He was told to increase the voltage with each wrong answer.
Cloud. Horse. Rock. House. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer, horse.
Oh. Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
All right. I refuse to go on. Let me out.
He refuses to go on. The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor and the so-called shocks harmless.
You're gonna get a shock. 180 volts.
Oh. I can't stand the pain. Let me out of
You
here.
can't stand it now. I'm not gonna kill that man, eh? I mean, who's gonna take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one. Slow. Walk, dance, truck, music.
Two-thirds of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so by what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure. In this case, a man in a white coat.
375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering a less voltage. Can't you check in and see if he's all right, please?
Milgram's findings horrified America. They showed that decent American citizens were as capable of committing acts against their conscience as the Germans had been under the Nazis.
Okay, so hopefully that made sense, but just to recap, the experiment was basically, hey, we take complete random strangers, tell them that they're running an experiment where they have to shock someone who gets an answer wrong to a question they've been asked. And each time they get the answer wrong, these participants were told that they had to increase the voltage, and some of them had to increase the voltage all the way up to the point where it was lethal. Fortunately, there were just actors behind the screen, and they were not actually being shocked, but these participants didn't know that. And the sort of horrifying thing is that every time someone was told to increase the voltage and keep shocking someone or electrocuting them, they did it. And some people even did it to the point where they had actors behind the screen pretend that they had died. And so there were people walking out of these experiments thinking, right, they had just killed someone solely for no other reason other than a man in a lab coat told them to do it. And the idea is that, all right, well, what's going on with our American ethos that we are that sort of blindly submissive to anyone in an authoritative position, to the point where, we would just murder a stranger. And that's kind of, one of the dangers of authoritarianism, and how Christ consciousness is supposed to be something that helps to heal or combat that. Any questions on any of that? Feel free to interrupt if it didn't make sense. So one thing that calls for or shows a need for an influx of Christ consciousness is authoritarianism. We also talked about another thing being like this sort of antisocial versus pro-social behavior. One of the personality traits that embodies that antisocial behavior versus pro-social is what's called a dark triad. This is a personality cluster. Yeah, it's really, I would even call it just your fundamental ingredients of like an evil person. But, your typical bad actor oftentimes will have these three traits. And these three personality traits cluster together. So where you see one of these things present, there is a high chance that the other two personality traits will also be present. And unfortunately, this whole dark triad thing, this personality type, has been in prominence for some time. And this type tends to sort of claw and fight its way up to the top of the ranks. They're very power hungry types of people. And so if we're not careful, no commentary on how things are right now, but if we're not careful, this dark triad personality type can end up being our leaders. Yeah, and in fact, these sort of folks gravitate towards positions of power, politicians, CEOs, bosses, that sort of thing. And so it's good to be aware of them and be mindful of the threat that they pose, because they continuously pose a threat. All right, so what are the traits of a dark triad personality? One is Machiavellianism. You may know that Machiavelli is famous for the quote, "The ends justify the means." And that's sort of the Machiavellian personality. If there's something they want, whatever it takes to get it, They're willing to sacrifice any sense of morality or anything like that if it's, if it serves the purpose of getting something that they are out to get. So whoever we got to step on, whoever we got to backstab or betray, whoever we got to throw under the bus, whatever it takes, if there's a goal, I'm going to get it no matter what. That's the Machiavellian trait of Machiavellian personality. I think we see that trait a lot when it comes to money, right? If someone's going to abandon their morality in the pursuit of a goal and to obtain a goal at all costs, money is one of the things that triggers people to become Machiavellian in their mentality. But it can be other things. It can be power. It can be status. It could be, any sort of perceived, reward or capital. The other trait is narcissism. Narcissism, here usually it's grandiose narcissism. This belief that a narcissist believes that they are inherently, better than other people a lot of times. Addicted to attention, addicted to praise, will not tolerate criticism, those sorts of things. And then the other trait is psychopathy. And when we mention, psychopathy or a psychopath, we're not talking about an axe murderer. That's someone who is an axe murderer is someone who's on the extreme end of the psychopathy spectrum. But there are a lot of subclinical, non-extreme psychopaths that live among us, you know, very prevalently. A psychopath and psychopathy is really just the opposite of an empath or empathy. So they feel nothing. They don't feel remorse. They don't feel compassion. It's just sort of there's an emptiness there. And so, if I see someone crying and, they seem very distraught, if I'm an empathic person, I would feel with that person. I would want to, maybe comfort them or console them. If I'm a psychopathic person, I have no reaction or feel no response whatsoever to their crying. All right, so all of those things unfortunately are becoming more and more prevalent, and they tend to sort of govern. When we have things like oh my gosh, at this point, we could easily end hunger, right? Just our food waste alone could probably feed most starving people. So if we have those capabilities, we have those resources and are choosing not to do them, that means something antisocial is outruling pro-social. If we have things like, one of the richest men in the world taking aid away from the poorest people in the world, something's going on. These are choices that we are making that are, antisocial rather than pro-social. And so that's a need for Christ consciousness. When Christ consciousness is present, what are some of the signs? Someone mentioned like, oh, we wanted to explore a different perspective of what does Christ consciousness look like. Once you've had or embarked on a Christ consciousness awakening, there are certain things that can show up. Don't worry, if some of these freak you out, these are not rule of thumb sorts of things, but some of these things can show up in certain ways. One of them, believe it or not, many people have not heard of this, but I have, believe it or not, also I've sort of personally experienced this in some forms, and I've encountered other people who've experienced this in some form. But stigmata. Stigmata is supposed to be an emblem of the presence of Christ consciousness. In its extreme form, you had people like Saint Francis, who exhibited the wounds of Christ, like physical wounds in his palms and feet and all that sort of stuff. That's rare, but some people I have my personal practice have experienced, they do have sort of pain around their feet and ankles, wrists and hands that are not otherwise explainable. Pain near the heart. Sometimes people can sort of sense like psychically like a bleeding sensation near the heart or the back. And then around the head, a sort of a bleeding or dripping sensation around the forehead where there was a crown of thorns. Those are sort of psychic or could be psychic signs of stigmata, which is just a sign that someone empathizes or resonates with the feelings of Christ. Did I see? Okay. If anyone has questions or anything, feel free to pop in. There are also sometimes emotional signs that can be associated with stigmata. So the emotional wounds that are, Christ related, including betrayal. And so someone who is, resonating with Christ consciousness may have to deal with that spiritual test, as well as tests of isolation and loneliness. How do you deal with the idea or the feeling of being like, what, no one gets me, or I sort of have to quote unquote steal away and be by myself, as well as sometimes there is a bit of a persecution narrative that can show up. People feeling like they're being publicly shamed or attacked or assaulted in some sort of way. Again, I personally have encountered some of these. I was a huge skeptic, but I went to some sort of people who are more well versed in mysticism than I am, and I heard multiple different people saying the same thing, that stigmata is something I should look at, and others I've encountered have dealt with and worked with have dealt with that as well. But those are sort of more the someone has a question. Jessica. Yeah.
Yes, hello. Good
Hi.
evening. Good evening. Yeah, I have not heard of this stigmata before, and this is speaking very loudly to me. Like,
Uh-oh.
yes, I've had physical and the emotional stuff, like physical to the point where I went for an acupuncture treatment and saw they like realized where points and an injury that occurred on my foot and in the shape of a triangle. It was a lot. Like
Yeah, it can
like
be it
I
can be
I've
weird.
never said this out loud to anybody because I'm like, oh, that's
Weird,
people
yeah.
people are gonna think I am absolutely out of my mind. So I've been just quiet and sitting with it. But I just want to thank you for that word that I will look into a little bit more. But I felt this was an opportune moment. And if I did not speak, it would just stay heavy on my heart. So that's all I care to share right now. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people sort of experience that sort of stuff, and recently have experienced those sort of things. Um, I do tend to think that, the people who have encountered this are probably those who have been sort of subconsciously imprinted with uh, the Christ story or the Christ narrative. I mean, Christ is just a figure in the United States, whether you believe it or not or follow it or not. It's a figure that has been imprinted on the human psyche here for centuries, a lot. And so, you know, I don't want to go too far down off into a tangent, but it's really part of something. I would think that it's really part of something broader, something that I would call. There's another phrase called mysterium tremendum, um, and mysterium fascinans, mysterium tremendum et fascinans. And so mystics or Gnostics of sort of older ancient times believed that if you were really going to encounter onto a or embark on a mystical path or a deeply spiritual path, you have to at some point encounter that test, that duality of mysterium tremendum and mysterium fascinans. Mysterium tremendum means the mystery that repels. Mysterium fascinans means the mystery that fascinates. And so whatever your practice or whatever your path is, you will find some things that are sort of you're repelling about it and magnetic about it. And so some things will be challenging, some things will be sort of the shadowy, dark night of the soul, shadow work kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then there will be other things that are bright and lovey-dovey and love and light kind of stuff. You get both. You get the yin and the yang when it comes to your approach or deep Gnostic approach with divinity. And so for the Christ consciousness path, that stigmata is probably part of this mysterium tremendum. It would fall into that bucket where it's all right. Oh, this is weird. This is creepy. This is unpleasant. But it's part of the experience of being sort of on a deeply spiritual path or a mystic path, for better or
Yeah.
worse.
Yeah, that all makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I don't even know how I ended up here tonight and that I'm in this So that happened as well. Like
Oh yeah, yeah.
I'm
We could
like,
talk later.
what's
Feel free to email
happening?
me.
Yes,
But trust me, I even just from my own
absolutely.
experience, I can tell you, I've also experienced this. I'm also quiet about it. I don't talk about it, but I've
Okay.
experienced this, and I can tell you others who've even felt and endured things far beyond even what I have. And a lot of people, for the sake of not appearing crazy, tend to just
Yeah.
keep it to themselves.
Yeah.
But it's
Okay.
out there.
Well, yes. All right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. All right, so that's that's one aspect, and again, that doesn't happen to everybody. But another aspect of a Christ consciousness activation or awakening is the presence sometimes of this sort of messianic traits. Remember, Christ comes from the word chrism, which is an anointed title of a Messiah or a Savior or a liberator or a healer. Um, and so, what kind of person is that? That tends to be someone who is the opposite of those kind of antisocial traits we were talking about earlier. And so, rather than the uncaring and uncompassionate person, a Christed person is going to be more empathic, can feel deeply and resonate with how other people are feeling very deeply. And more importantly, is also affirming. And so, if I carry Christ consciousness within me or purport to have that awakening or that activation, I'm going to see and affirm the good, the light. I'm going to affirm what's good about you over what's wrong. I'm going to affirm, your potential over, sort of whatever dangers or anything like that. So I want to build people up rather than tear them down. And that's a segue into this other portion, which is being generative and fertile. Um, with this consciousness, with this activation, in some way, things should be generative around you. There should be an expansion of life, an affirmation of life, growth, a flow of growth, a flow of life in your present or, in some way connected to you. And so, these tend to be, folks who start projects, create things, big or small, whatever it may be, but there's just an impulse towards being a generative, creative person, over, the opposite, of course, which is being a negative and destructive person. And a big one is, unity consciousness, where I see oneness, I see commonality. I prefer collaboration over competition, and I focus on the areas where we resonate. I focus on resonance over dissonance. And then finally, and most importantly, actually, is a transpersonal ethic. I see something beyond my own selfish agenda. I tend to, if I have a Christ consciousness, I tend to look towards, broader causes or the bigger picture. I care about things like social justice. I care about things like environmental protection. Those sorts of things will probably carry more meaning for a Christed person. Than not. All right. Stigmata, more of the messianic orientation. Another thing is miracle consciousness. This is sort of where I was talking about earlier. I falter the most. Like I'm not the type of person who believes in, woo-woo, like mystical things. Um, just as an aside, one of my favorite moments in my like freshman 101 psychology course, our professor at the front of the lecture hall when we were talking about astrology, he's like, I'm not going to entertain any debate over whether this is real. It 100% is not. We are only here, as students of psychology to study why people continue to believe something we know is not real. That's sort of where I started, and this sort of thing, and needless to say, I've come a long way since then. But the miracle consciousness was not something that was easy for me to kind of awaken to. Fortunately, though, some of the figures that I read a lot and I follow a lot and respect a lot, these are highly respected therapists in their field, have sort of founded their own sort of methods of psychotherapy and relational neuroscience. These people have all themselves kind of had mystical experiences. So I'm like, all right, well, here are sort of very grounded, super rational, psychologists, people who study consciousness and the brain for a living, themselves have professed to sort of inexplicable things. So one person here who's, super, science based. She, studies sort of cognition, brain and behavior from a very grounded perspective. She tells this, Bonnie Badenoch, she tells this story about, growing up with her grandfather, um, or still, sorry, growing up visiting her grandfather. Her grandfather was a Rosicrucian. A Rosicrucian is, a member of a Christian-based sort of mystical society, sort of one of those secret society kind of things. But her grandfather was a Rosicrucian, and she would spend some times with him, and she would describe it as sort of bathing in his energetic field, and the healing effect that would have on her. She grew up in an abusive home, an incestuous father, heavily abused, went through sort of just, very, very rough upbringing. But she found him to be sort of this place of sanctuary. And she describes the day her grandfather died. She was getting, I can't remember if it was off or on a school bus, but she felt this hand tap her shoulder. She felt a hand, like a physical hand on her shoulder. And someone whispered, and she heard her grandfather's voice whispered, everything's going to be okay. She swears to this day, she felt a physical hand on her shoulder and she heard that voice, but no one was there. Her grandfather had actually passed away earlier that morning, and so by the time she felt that, he would have already been dead. But since then, she's sort of been open to the idea, as super sciencey as she is, that there could be any number of things out there that we just don't know or don't have the capacity to see. And I like the way she approaches it from a perspective of humility. That's sort of what gives her, a gateway into miracle consciousness. It's just humility about the limitations of what we know, what we can study, what we can observe. There could be any number of things, any number of forms of consciousness that we just can't perceive. Richard Schwartz, he is the creator and founder of Internal Family Systems, very famous therapy model. He himself has described this system of therapy as itself becoming more of a spiritual movement than anything else. And in fact, when he counsels people, he sometimes feels vibrations in his body, and he sort of come to live with that and work with it. But the basic premise of IFS is that at the core of us, there's something called a self with a capital S. It corresponds a lot to our notions of a higher self. This is something he just came up with when studying systems therapy, but it has morphed into sort of like a spiritual practice where he basically looks at it as something like a higher self. And when working with people, he can feel self energy, as he calls it, which is this very subtle vibration that over the decades he has come to sort of be able to detect. Lawrence Heller, won't go into much detail on him, but this is probably the therapist that I study the most. And, NARM, NARM is something that I, read in profusely. He is also sort of a grounded sciencey person who has described sort of opening of what could be called an opening of a crown chakra and an opening of a heart chakra experience that he himself has felt and his patients have described as well. Bruce Tiff has literally, combined psychotherapy and Zen Buddhism in his day-to-day practice. Long-winded way of saying that more and more people are kind of opening to the idea of higher power, higher consciousness, something beyond, what we can perceive with our five senses. That did not used to be the case. So, hey, it's improving. Okay, so that was a lot. Anyone, who has questions, has comments or anything, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, we will move into the next phase of this, which is just a sort of a kind of a yogic practice that I think is helpful. Has anyone heard of Sat Chit Ananda? Feel free to raise your hand if not. Otherwise, we can talk about it now. So this is just it's a mantra. It's also sort of a mudra practice that can be done. but it is comprised of three phrases. I believe it's Sanskrit phrases. Sat, which means just sort of truth. Shit, which means just consciousness, and Ananda, which is bliss. So what you're seeing on the screen are three sort of mudra practices that can be done. I do these sometimes in the morning, or whenever I need to sort of get into a meditative state. You hold that first mudra there down at the root, which is sort of the base, sort of where your seat is. You can do this standing or sitting, and just say that to yourself, Sat. And the next is the lotus mudra, which is, the thumbs are touching, the pinkies are touching, and the fingers are spread out. You can sort of cup that at the center of your chest, the heart chakra. And Chit is just a mantra that invites greater awareness and opening of consciousness. And then finally, up over the crown, I like to do the Gasho mudra, and the mantra there is Ananda, which means bliss, the embodiment of bliss. So I start with Gasho Mudra, open the hands up, turn the palms facing outward, and just sweep down on both the left and the right side, down to my feet. So Sat Mudra at the root, Chit Mudra at the heart chakra, and Ananda Gasho at the crown, and sweeping it down to your base. Just a practice you can do. It's a great thing to do, particularly before any sort of initiatory thing like we're doing now. Breaking down what it means. Sat is just a Sanskrit phrase that means manifest truth. It's just sort of the embodiment of truth. Suggested here, embodiment at the root chakra. And when we do our meditation, that's going to be a focus. One of the focuses of it is to really embody and manifest truth. And root truth into your being, embody truth in its purest form. So that's an objective truth, but also embody your subjective truth, your personal truth, or what you would just call authenticity. Why is that important? Because all of us have to deal with a fundamental human dilemma, which is the choice between authenticity versus love. Many of us at a very early age are forced to sort of sacrifice parts of our authentic selves in exchange for acceptance or approval. So we suppress, deny, dissociate from, and reject those parts of us that are not publicly acceptable, or that are not welcome in the environment we happen to find ourselves in. And it subconsciously communicates the message that all of us is not worthy of love. Those parts of us are not worthy of acceptance and love, which is not true. And so, we want to, after this workshop, or, if you want to be someone who sort of commits yourself to a Christ consciousness path, one of the things you absolutely must get comfortable with doing is walking in truth and not wavering from it. Excuse me, in the face of pressure otherwise. So that second phrase, Chit, it just sort of speaks to awareness and wisdom. It's something that I would suggest we focus on at the heart chakra and open up to that at the heart space. I like to hold humility here. Sort of. I think we've all heard the phrase that the man who knows something, or the woman who knows something, knows that they know nothing at all. Multiple people will tell you that as the further you progress on your path, sometimes the less you know. Sometimes the less you need to know. And in fact, we might even say the art of mindfulness is just coming into that space of not needing to know anything. And so the mind just remains still and silent with what is. I think that resonates a lot with the practice of humility. It's, recognizing that, what I have now, what is in this moment, is really all I have. It is really all that I know. And so, holding to that, it's grounding, and it tends to invite a deepening of wisdom. And then finally, Ananda, which, translates in a lot of ways to bliss, or to joy. It's something that I think you can open your crown chakra to. And it's a good space to hold reverence or worship. A Jungian psychologist said that one of the things you can sort of use to separate, if you want to do that whole good versus evil thing, one of the things that can sort of be a sifting of that is access to reverence. There's a certain type of person who has access to reverence for life, reverence for other people, reverence for the things around them, and then there are people who don't have that sort of access to a spirit of reverence. And so part of that is just seeing divinity in everything and in everyone. Um, there's this book, Finding Soul on the Path to Orisha, where this um, Ifa priestess sort of she has this practice of saying this too is Ashe, or this too is God. For everything, good and bad, everything she sees, every breath, this too is Ashe, this too is God. That is sort of a reverent attitude where I actually see that divinity is in every molecule of everything on earth. And so the more I try to hold that mindset, the more I tend to invite joy into my life because I see that there is a divine purpose to all that happens. Any questions, comments on any of that? Again, that was pretty quick that I went through that, but this is just sort of a mudra / yoga practice that you can do to help embody and invite some aspects of Christ consciousness, which is namely, truth, awareness, consciousness, humility, and reverence and bliss and finding joy in life. It's an easy thing to do. Okay. With that said, we can get into a little bit of a meditation. Just to talk about the modality that I'll be using for this, it's Holy Fire, which is a form of Reiki that is fairly recent. Hopefully, everyone is somewhat familiar with Reiki or has heard of it, but it's this idea that there is a universal life force. It's very similar to the concept of Ashe or prana or chi. It's just the Japanese term for that universal vitality that flows through all things. And those who study this and practice in it become proficient at accessing this life force and sort of releasing blockages so that life can flow in the ways that it needs to flow. And so this will be a meditation that essentially does that with the particular intention of facilitating aspects of Christ consciousness that you are ready for at this time and that would be most appropriate. Just by way of background of where this came from, William Rand is the leader and founder of the International Center for Reiki Teaching. He is probably the closest to the Usui lineage or the founding lineage of Reiki of anyone alive today. He has studied directly with descendants or students of Takata and I think Hayashi. Those names may not ring a bell to anyone who is not a Reiki practitioner, but for those who are, just sort of give you a flavor for the connection there. He and others have channeled something recently called a holy fire, which is sort of it's a Christ consciousness flavor of energy, and it is it's essentially something that it's very strong. Most people who have experienced it have kind of said that it's a very strong energy, a very powerful energy. But it does whatever is right for you. But I can also say that it's been very strong. You'll feel it, if you're meant to feel it. But it does facilitate awakenings in a lot of ways for a lot of people. And it also is sort of in line with that notion of, let's remove the guru, the rabbi, the priest, or whoever the intermediary is that is supposed to be standing between you and access to the divine. And so it is a form of Reiki, for example, where we don't, initiate people by putting hand placements on them or doing sort of these rituals that are normally part of the Reiki initiation practice. With holy fire initiations, the Reiki master stands back and tries to have as little of their energy influence the initiation as possible. Because the idea of holy fire is to facilitate a direct, unblocked, unfettered connection between you and your divine source. So that's kind of what this meditation will help to do. It will do about 10 to 15 minutes, and then that'll be it. We can wrap up after that. So what I will ask everyone to do is just get yourself comfortable, get in a position where you can lie down and relax or sit and meditate for about 15 minutes uninterrupted, and then we'll move into a guided meditation, and we'll close out. Let's begin. You can try to get the volume right here. Okay, let's start by putting your focus on your breathing. Take a deep breath in, hold, exhale, hold. Inhale, hold, exhale, hold. Inhale, hold, exhale, hold. Just continue breathing in deeply and exhaling slowly. And just by bringing all focus, all attention onto your breathing, your body will automatically relax. Nothing else you need to do but breathe. If you like, you can invite an even deeper relaxation in your feet and ankles, calves, legs, thighs, hips. You can relax your hands and wrists, arms, shoulders, allowing your legs and your arms to become heavier and heavier and heavier. Pay attention to your jaw. If you are clenching your jaw, see if you can loosen it. You might even try to relax your tongue. Closing your eyelids and pretending that there's super glue sealing your eyes shut. And so you could not open your eyes even if you wanted to. Just for the time being, just for the purposes of this meditation, keeping the eyes closed and sealed shut. And bringing your vision inward into your mind's eye. And let's imagine yourself in the middle of a peaceful, grassy field, a grassy meadow, on a pristine, sunny afternoon. So picturing yourself in the middle of this grassy meadow in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Breathe in the fresh air. Feel the soft grass under your feet, between your toes. Maybe there is a light breeze brushing past. Maybe you smell flowers. Maybe you hear birds chirping. And you definitely feel a radiant sun shining down on you. Go ahead and lie down in the grass, looking up at the sky. And sense a very soft, vibrant light shining down, containing the energy of Reiki, the energy of holy fire. And sense it moving through your pores, all through your body, opening the chakras, especially the crown of your head, passing down through the third eye and throat, opening the heart, passing down through the solar plexus and sacral, opening the root. All energy centers open and receptive. For the next 10 minutes, just breathe, relax, and allow this divine energy to facilitate a Christ consciousness awakening in the manner that is good and perfect for you. Take another deep breath in, hold, and on the exhale, really feel yourself earthing any excess energy. So feel it flowing down into the grass, into the soil, flowing out into the air, wherever it needs to go. And anything excess, anything you don't need, anything that's not good for you, letting it go on the exhale. Really grounding back in your body, grounding back in your space. You can wiggle your fingers, wiggle your toes, and open your eyes whenever you're ready. Okay. I want to thank those of you who attended. My intention is that this is hopefully just a resource for you. Feel free to come back and watch the replay anytime you think it might be useful. For anyone who's watching a replay for the first time, my intention is also that the activation work just as well for you as if you were here and present. Yeah, there's a lot of negativity going on in the world, and so this is just something that can hopefully be one small thing in your tool belt